At first glance, it was an ordinary house in Lower Austria. Once upon a time, a good family lived here, a father, a wife, and several children. They were respected people in the small town of Amstetten. For 24 years, no one suspected what horror was happening in the basement of this house. The truth came out only in 2008, when 42-year-old Elisabeth Fritzl escaped from the basement of this house. She looked like an old woman, gray hair, hunchback, wrinkles on her face, pale skin. She could barely stand because she spent 24 years in a cramped room underground. Her father, Josef Fritzl, placed her there when she was still an 18-year-old girl, and all these years he constantly tortured her. There, in the basement, Elisabeth gave birth to 7 children without any medical care. But what happened to the prisoner of the dungeon and her children 16 years later? How were they able to adapt to normal life? And what difficulties did they face in their freedom? Josef Fritzl and his wife Rosemary seemed like an ordinary family in Austria. They lived in a large house and raised 7 children. Their eldest daughter, Elisabeth, went to a regular school and did not attract attention to herself in any way. She never complained to anyone about her mistreatment at home. As her classmates described her, the girl was calm, friendly, and sweet. But no one knew that she had suffered since childhood. When she was 11, her father began to take a particular interest in her, the kind of interest no father should show in his daughter. All Elisabeth dreamed of was to escape from home. At the age of 15, she got a job as a waitress to earn money for leaving home. At 17, she ran away, but since she was underage, the police returned her home. Elisabeth only had to wait a little longer to come of age and leave home forever, but in an instant all her dreams collapsed. In 1984, when Elisabeth was 18 years old, her father lured her to the basement. He asked her to help him with carrying the door. The girl agreed and fell into a trap. Josef Fritzl put a rag with a sleeping pill on her mouth, and when Elisabeth woke up, she found herself in the basement of her house. Thus began the painful years in captivity. Josef Fritzl made a slave out of his daughter. He came to her almost daily and forced her to do whatever he asked. Fritzl scared her that if she tried to escape, he would release poisonous gas into the room or electrocute her. No one would have heard her if Elisabeth had screamed, since the room was deep underground, behind 8 doors. None of the family members knew about this secret room, because Fritzl has thought of everything down to the last detail. He started building this room 4 years ago. He secretly equipped the basement, brought furniture there, and installed plumbing. And he did it all this to carry out his evil plan to gain complete control over his daughter Elisabeth. Josef told his wife Rosemary that their oldest daughter had run away and joined the cult. For everyone to believe him, he forced Elisabeth to write a farewell letter, which she told about her escape. The mother quickly recognized her daughter's handwriting and believed the story. However, she still contacted the police with a request to find Elisabeth. Soon, everyone completely forgot about her because they decided that she was already an adult and could live independently as she wanted. But all these 24 years, Elisabeth was nearby, in the basement of this house. It is surprising that Rosemary forgot her daughter so quickly and that she had no suspicions. She knew well that her husband was prone to committing crimes. In his youth, when they were already married, Josef Fritzl once attacked a nurse in her house. For this, he was sentenced to 18 months in prison, but Rosemary was not at all embarrassed by this. She waited for her husband's return and even brought him parcels to jail. Fritzl was also suspected of committing several other crimes, but his guilt was not proven. Perhaps if the mother had been more attentive to her children, she would have long noticed her husband's unusual interest in her daughter, but she did not want to see anything. She also did not notice that for all 24 years, her husband was constantly spending time somewhere else. Was she obverse to his double life, or did she just not want to know anything about his dirty secrets? For the first 5 years, poor Elisabeth lived in the basement utterly alone. She spent all her time without sunlight in a cramped room like a dog's kennel, with almost no movement. In addition, her father came to her nearly every day and fulfilled his dirtiest fantasies with her. This life was worse than in the strictest prison in the world. 5 years later, Elisabeth realized she was pregnant. She had to give birth to the baby herself without medical assistance. The monster simply left her a book on obstetrics, and he did not care at all what would happen to her and to the child. So, in 1988, Elisabeth gave birth to her first daughter, Kerstin, who lived with her in this basement for another 19 years. Her second child was born 2 years later, son Stefan, who also lived with her in the basement until the last day of captivity. In total, Elisabeth gave birth to 7 children while in the basement. One of the babies died. Over the years, Josef Fritzl dropped 3 more children at the door of his house, along with a note from Elisabeth. Fritzl and his wife adopted these children and raised them as their own. Elisabeth gave birth to her last child, a boy, Felix, in 2002. Fritzl could not take him into the house and left him in the basement because his wife could not look after another baby. So Elisabeth lived in the basement for several years with 3 children. This life was the worst torture. If the monster did not like something, he completely turned off the lights and left them without food or water for several days. One day he forced them to dig a new room to increase the living area. Elisabeth and the children worked hard daily. They dug new spaces with their bare hands. Who knows, perhaps no one would have ever known about the existence of this hell on earth. Fritzl could quickly get rid of his exhausted captive and her children and dissolve their bodies in acid, but one lucky incident helped them to be released. In 2008, 19-year-old Kerstin felt very ill. She was almost dying. Elisabeth convinced the monster to take his daughter to the hospital. Fritzl was already old and had lost his vigilance, so he agreed. That same evening, he released Elisabeth, Stefan, and Felix from the basement and brought them upstairs, informing his wife that Elisabeth had decided to come home after a 24-year-old absence. Elisabeth immediately went to the hospital to see her daughter and then to the police, where she told about all the atrocities of her father. A DNA test and inspection of the basement confirmed her words. Fritzl was arrested, and this story instantly spread worldwide and became a huge shock. According to the court's decision, the monster will spend the rest of his life in an Austrian prison. But is this a fair punishment? Eventually, in prison, Fritzl can see sunlight, go to walks, and even use the gym. He can do everything his daughter and grandchildren have been deprived of all these years. A forensic psychiatrist diagnosed him with a severe combined personality disorder and recommended treatment for the rest of his life. He was a completely mad man who had lost touch with reality. How little humanity there was in him if he could do such an atrocity to his daughter. It seems that the devil himself has possessed him. However, Fritzl himself never realized his guilt. He said that he did not consider himself a monster, as described in the press. In an interview he said, "I miss my family very much. I am sure that we are going to be reunited, and I think they are going to forgive me for what I have done." In his defense, Fritzl said he cared for Elisabeth all these years, giving her flowers and cooking food. He shamelessly gave interviews saying, "Just look into the cells of other people. You might find other families and girls down there." His wife, Rosemary, filed for divorce and never visited her ex-husband in prison, despite his numerous requests and pleas for forgiveness. The children who lived in the house with him also disowned him. Today, Josef Fritzl is 88 years old and he is living out his last years in prison, where he will never leave. As for Elisabeth and her children, they were placed under special protection by the authorities. First of all, they had to undergo long-term treatment with a psychiatrist and other doctors. For the first time in 24 years, Elisabeth saw sunlight and began to breathe clean, fresh air. She left prison as a 42-year-old woman. However, according to an eyewitness, she looked older than her years. She was completely gray, with deep wrinkles on her face, with a hunched back. All her teeth were also rotten. All these are the consequences of terrible treatment and an unhealthy lifestyle in the basement. Her 3 children, 19-year-old Kirstin, 18-year-old Stefan, and 6-year-old Felix, saw the sun for the first time. Freed from the basement, they were surprised by simple things: rain, wind, green grass, cars on the street. They had never seen all this before. At first, they just stood and looked at everything around them in surprise. Kirstin, who was ill, soon recovered. However, for her, as well as for her mother and siblings, the years in the basement will forever remain a significant trauma. After their release, the dungeon prisoners suffered from mental illness for a long time. They were frightened by the slightest noise and sometimes became hysterical. Fortunately, the Austrian authorities provided them with good medical care, and then they were moved to another house, whose address is kept in the strictest confidence. Also, Elisabeth and her children changed identities to start a new life without unnecessary attention. Elisabeth also met her 3 children who had lived in the house with her parents all these years. The children experienced great shock when they found out who their biological mother was and under what circumstances they were born. However, they soon established a good relationship with her. As for Rosemary, Fritzl's wife, she had to leave this family. Elisabeth was not able to forgive her mother for not being interested in her life, not looking for her after her disappearance, and ignoring her husband's suspicious behavior for many years. Rosemary lives alone in a secret place, only occasionally visiting her grandchildren. It seemed that Elisabeth and her children had started a new life. However, just a year after leaving their father's dungeon, she had to return to a psychiatric clinic. The reason for this was one unpleasant incident. Despite carefully guarding the privacy of this family, the British paparazzi could still track down the place where Elisabeth lived. First, they waylaid a woman and her daughter as they returned home from the store, and then they traced where they lived, rang the doorbell, and broke into their house. The paparazzi caught Elisabeth in the kitchen while she was preparing food. They took a few pictures and quickly left the country to avoid punishment. Indeed, several British tabloids subsequently published photographs of the family but blurred out their faces. Elizabeth and her children experienced new trauma, and it took a long time to recover from it. Today, Elisabeth Fritzl is 57 years old. According to the Daily Mail tabloid, today she lives in an isolated riverside home, just half an hour from the dungeon where the monster held her, according to Austrian law. Disclosing exact information about Elizabeth's whereabouts and her personal data is strictly forbidden. There is only general information about her life. Today she lives in a two-story house in a tiny village of a few hundred people near her hometown of Amstetten. A large fence surrounds her home, and CCTV cameras are installed everywhere to prevent strangers from entering the territory. Directly opposite is the house of her daughter, Kirsten, which is also well guarded. Locals know the story of this family but remain silent about it because they respect their privacy. Sometimes the woman goes to dances and visits a local restaurant. She has improved her posture and grown her hair long, but is still very pale. It is also known that in 2019 Elisabeth married her bodyguard, Thomas Wagner, who is 23 years younger. They are probably still together. The couple became close after spending several months together and married when Elisabeth was 52. People around them say that Elisabeth feels safe with this man. This relationship also gave her a lot of strength to return to a normal life. According to people familiar with the situation, Elisabeth enjoys shopping, showering frequently, and driving today. She also receives a reasonable allowance from the state, which covers all her necessary expenses. Many years later, she finally forgave her mother and began communicating with her more often, and all her children got along. The basement where Elisabeth spent 24 years was filled with concrete, and the house was sold on the open market. It's all for today. Remember that evil is near, and thanks for watching.